What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 90, and I am the host, Kyle Anslone. Solo show today, a lot of news to cover. Before I get into the news, I want to talk to y'all about some ways you could help out the show. The first way is just by sharing the show. We have Facebook, MeWe, and Twitter accounts. On all the accounts, we post short clips from all the show. Those clips have actually helped to drive quite a few new listeners and subscribers to the show. So if people could take the time to hit the share button, especially on Facebook and Twitter, where MeWe puts our content in front of the people who like our pages and stuff. That doesn't happen on Facebook and Twitter. We have people who like the show who say they never see the the content after they like the conflicts of interest page. So if you're on those platforms and you see it, please hit the share button. It will help us out. It would be great if you subscribe to the content, especially the video versions. Odyssey is the best option for that because it tokenizes the video content, giving me and Will rewards without having to go through the YouTube super chat feature where they take a huge percentage of what people end up donating. But subscribing to the show anywhere would be great. It's up everywhere. People could listen to audio podcasts as well. Of course, the show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute, where I am the news editor, and I also write the daily news roundup. So if you go there and click on the masthead, my name, you'll see all the episodes of the show, all my news roundups, and of course there you have the show notes pages with the links to everywhere you can need to go. All right, and then the last thing to plug would be the sponsor of the show, Paloma Verde. Paloma Verde sells great CBD products. Look, it's 2021. Most of us have tried CBD. It's not THC even, so it doesn't get you high. We just know that it could help out a little bit with like pain, headaches, anxiety, insomnia. And so, with especially the rough year that 2020 was, and that 2021 is continuing to be, in the mask insanity and the lockdowns and all of this, maybe you need a little bit to help yourself relax. So try some products over at Paloma Verde. All their products are lab tested, so they're going to do the same thing for you every time, and they're going to work. They're not, just gummy worms that you bought at the head shop that somebody put in a plastic bag and slapped a label on. Again, lab tested results. So that's PalomaVerdeStore.com. Use the promo code PEACE, PEACE, to get 25% off at checkout. Now let's get into the news. Again, the first couple stories here today are good news. The bump stop ban loses big in federal court. One of the weird paradoxes that we have in the U.S. is that sometimes the most aggressive anti-Second Amendment laws are enacted under Republican presidents, where, it's during the Democrats that everybody's terrified that they're coming for the guns and stuff like that. But after the 2017 Las Vegas shooting, where I still don't think the FBI actually figured out the motive for that thing, some guy went from a hotel room, fired on a concert below, killing scores of people. Absolutely horrific. Trump then signs an executive order, and the Department of Justice carries out that executive order in 2018 by issuing a Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearm and Explosives rule to clarify that bump stocks are machine guns as defined by the National Firearms Act of 1934 and the Gun Control Act of 1968. And so they're using decades-old laws here, in the Firearms Act of 1934, I guess, closing in on a century here, to kind of redefine what a bump stock is, what it does, and making those illegal. Now, they claim, and so I've never fired a bump stock gun myself. I've seen a couple of them. I actually haven't seen one fired either. People just show me, like, hey, I had this thing. And again, this was before 2018. I have no idea if these people still have their bump stocks. I'm sure that they, lost them in a boating accident or however these things get worked out. But the claim is that you could pull the trigger once and that the gun will recoil, and then the bump stock will bump the recoil back forward, and so you could essentially hold the gun in place and not move your finger, but the trigger's going to keep getting pulled, and it's supposed to turn a semi-automatic firearm into a automatic. I think that there's probably some exaggerating with how much I don't think it turns any old semi-automatic into an M16 that could fire 30 rounds with pulling down the trigger once, but it is probably a situation where it's easier to fire rounds faster with the bump stock on the gun. And so after this rule was passed, a group, Gun Owners of America, this is something like the NRA, but that actually looks to defend gun rights, at least from time to time. They took it to federal court, and the federal government invoked and argued the legal doctrine of Chevron deference, which says when the judiciary is confronted with an ambiguous statute, the default position for the presiding judge is to defer to the reasonable statutory interpretation favored by the federal agency in charge with enforcing that statute. So I guess, the problem I really have with this is that if you're dealing with laws that are almost a century old, the way we use language changes, technology changes enough that anything I think is going to become ambiguous. And then you have all these heads of federal agencies who maybe were confirmed by the Senate, but certainly didn't get any votes from the American people. And a lot of them, are losers in the former presidential campaign. People didn't want in charge of their lives, now have the power to basically make any statute reasonable and then change laws without Congress actually passing anything new, the president not signing any laws. But there was a bombshell ruling by the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals that denied the Chevron deference in this case because it does not apply in the criminal law context. This seems like a good call and important to me, that you can't change what criminal laws, things that people could go to jail for, actually mean without passing a new law to say that this is a new crime that we want to address. Not that the way technology advances, we can't have things that are ways to act criminally and add violence on people that they couldn't before. So maybe even a more libertarian society, you would have a case where you would pass a new law to clarify some new kind of fraud or something like that. But that shouldn't be done, just by court decisions and throwing things out, especially now when you're talking about things as broad as a bump stop ban. And so it ends up getting thrown out. I think court said that the statute poses a severe risk to individual liberty. So a somewhat positive ruling here. I'm not saying that Congress, especially in the wake of the two shootings in the past few weeks, and I think some real energy among some people in Congress to try to pass some gun control reform, that they maybe won't look back at the bump stop ban. If you want to own a bump stock and not have any concern about violating any federal law, I'm not sure I would quite buy one yet. I might wait until see what the Democrats end up trying to pass as far as gun control reform. But at least for now, I suppose they are legal, and this could, of course, head to the Supreme Court, and who knows how they'll rule. Another good news, this article from Fox News: New York City ends qualified immunity for police officers. The city council passed this, and I believe Mayor Bill de Blasio has signaled that he will go ahead and sign this or approve it into law, however that it works in New York court. This does only apply to police officers, and so there are a lot of cases where qualified immunity allows for vast abuses of the law by state employees who aren't cops. And I'm talking mostly about prosecutors who are able to either make things up or, tell people, oh, we had this whole file of evidence. We have your fingerprints on the gun. We know that you killed them. And if you don't confess and sign this statement right now, we're going to try to put you in the electric chair. Stuff like that should be misconduct and should be illegal. It isn't considered that way, and people are able to get away with it because of doctrines like qualified immunity. But in the wake of George Floyd's death in particular, and some of the just situations people are looking at of how cops get away with murdering people, qualified immunity really is shown itself to be a major problem. And even if it doesn't go all the way to killing somebody, just, cops abusing the civil rights of people, having absolutely no reason for suspicion. But I think in Colorado, it was Aurora recently, where our entire family was forced, face first onto the pavement, the kids as well. And because Colorado has reformed its qualified immunity laws, those cops could potentially face charges. Me and Will have talked about a case where cops received qualified immunity after, I believe, beating a man on his own front porch. And so there's a lot of cases where qualified immunity can lead to cops getting away with, including murder. And so it's really great that they're having some reform on this for New York City police officers. Now, there's the issue. This probably isn't going to apply to federal police officers. Who knows if it will apply to state police officers who are working in New York City. But again, this could help to have some reforms. I think the big advantage to qualified immunity is that if you could go to jail, not even that most cops who commit crimes would then go to jail, but maybe the possibility of going to jail, even if it's like a 25% chance, may help to curb some crimes committed by cops. Another couple provisions within this bill is it gives the Civilian Complaint Review Board an ability to investigate racial bias in policing, and it's going to require the city to collect more data on racial bias or more data on race when it comes to policing, to see if it shows systematic violent racism and stuff like that. So I think those are all positive steps. And, we have a police force here today that we absolutely have to deal with. And so I think one of the better ways is to end qualified immunity. Another thing you could do is to end the war on drugs, and a step that New York State is taking is to pass legalized weed. The state Senate, I guess, passed the bill, and it now heads to Governor Andrew Cuomo's desk, and he said that he would sign it. If signed, it would the legalization would be effective immediately, but recreational sales are not expected to begin for a year or two. So it's going to be like a Massachusetts situation. I was living there at the time, and I would use this service. I don't want to say the name of it because I haven't asked them if they would like me to promote it, but you had to order a luxury t-shirt that cost like $100, and they would bring you a plain white tee and a quarter of weed. And so that was kind of the game there. And maybe something will occur like that in New York until they start to legalize different sites where you could go out and buy recreational marijuana. The problem that once even that the recreational sites were starting to open in Massachusetts, they gave them out so infrequently. They were kind of hard to park at. There were always cops and possibly feds standing outside, so it was kind of uncomfortable to go. And the prices weren't any better than the luxury t-shirt delivery service. And so it was, I knew people who did that over going and just doing the regular legal thing because it was a lot more convenient. They delivered it, and you didn't have to, go encounter a bunch of cops to do that. But this is a step in the right direction. The more that we end the prohibition, the war on drugs, the less awful policing we're going to see in this country. All right, the next story I have is Facebook suspends Maduro, that is Venezuela's president, and Venezuela called that digital totalitarianism. So what happened here, and this is a kind of interesting story on a few levels. Again, Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, his Facebook account, I'm not sure if he's sitting there and doing his Facebook himself, if he knows what goes on. I have no idea. But his Facebook account promoted a Venezuelan-made remedy for COVID-19. Apparently, a lot of it is thyme, the herb thyme that's in there. I don't know anything about this. I'm not promoting it. I don't know if it works. The Venezuela says it works. Facebook says they don't even have evidence of that. I'm sure they claim to have some kind of evidence. But Facebook says that basically they have standards that says you cannot go against the WHO, and the WHO says there's no cure for COVID. I think I think this reveals a dogmatic problem at Facebook, that the idea that you would have one body that you're going to look to and say they know all the science, they know everything about COVID, and so we're only going to let people who agree with them or who promote their narrative speak on our platform. If they are wrong, if the WHO ends up being wrong, then you're shutting down any kind of dissent on a virus that, you know, has had the biggest impact on our country of any virus maybe ever, certainly in a century. So I think conversation's absolutely huge. Again, I'm not saying that people should be going out and like trying this Venezuelan product or anything like that, but at the same time, why does Facebook censor this? They haven't tested it to say that this definitely doesn't work. They just, you know, say the WHO says it's not possible for it to work, so we're going to censor it. The other issue is something that myself, Will Porter, and I think Connor Freeman talked about on the show pretty recently, that when you're banning content by a country's leader, it makes it really hard for people, and especially independent journalists like myself, to go back and look at what happened over the Trump administration. So much of the direct communication the country got from Trump, so much of his actual ideas came through his Twitter account, and now all that is gone. Now there's like screenshots of tweets, but there's also screenshots of fake tweets, and so it makes it very hard to go back and do any actual looking into what happened in the Trump administration, especially for people in the independent media. And I think, you know, people in Venezuela, maybe it would be helpful to have that post up, even to shame Maduro with it. All right, now let's get into some Afghanistan news. Here we have from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Taliban threatens to target U.S. troops if Biden stays in Afghanistan. Biden says that we're leaving Afghanistan. He says he would be surprised if U.S. troops were there still in 2022. But at the same time, he seems pretty committed to not meeting the May 1st deadline. And once you don't meet that deadline, the agreement that was outlined during the Trump administration, I believe Biden kept the Trump ambassador to Afghanistan, Zalmay Khalilzad, on board. And so it's the deal that he worked out. And if we don't follow that, if we break that agreement, then I think it's a pretty, we go back to kind of square one on withdrawing from Afghanistan. Now, it is possible that Biden is trying to take this seriously and get U.S. troops out of Afghanistan, and maybe he just is being stonewalled on a logistical level, and by the end of May, U.S. troops will be out of there. Although I doubt it, and I think more that he's unsure of what to do in Afghanistan, so he's not going to withdraw troops by May 1st. And when no easy resolution comes to the fore, when you know all the intelligent people get together in the room and decide that there's no way the U.S. could pull out of Afghanistan without allowing the Taliban to take over Kabul, I think he's going to decide to find a way to continue the mission, even if it's a little bit more scaled down than what we're doing right now. Trump carried out a lot of airstrikes in Afghanistan, so even with a small troop presence, we could have a huge impact in that country. On a recent show, myself and Will Porter talked about the proposals going on in Afghanistan for a potential peace deal between the Taliban and the Afghan government. The U.S. initially proposed that the Afghan government would, I guess, kind of dissolve. An interim government would be put in place. Constitutional reforms would be debated on, and then an election would be held, I believe, on the constitutional reforms too. Afghanistan's president rejected that and proposed a counter plan where elections would be held in 6 months, and he says he promises to step aside if elections are held. Now, in this article from Reuters, he doesn't make it clear if he would run in the upcoming elections, and if he's saying that I would step aside once elections are held and if I happen to lose, or if he's saying that I'm done with this president thing. Once elections are held, I'm not even going to run. I'll step aside. That's unclear. Also, how Afghanistan is going to hold elections, and again, a country where I don't think they're really moving towards, at least at not a very quick pace, of vaccinating their population with the COVID vaccine. Not that I think is a requirement to like open up a society. However, I think it would be hard to organize an election backed by the U.S. government that's COVID crazy, to have them support an election where COVID could be an issue, I think would be difficult. And so I see a lot of problems with trying to hold elections in Afghanistan in the next even year or two. And that's in part based on the 2016 elections that got pushed back, and they really didn't even hold elections in many of the heavily Pashtun areas of the country. All right, I have an article. Oh, so yeah, so this is, he's saying that he's going to step aside. Maybe it'd be nice, but we'll see. Next article here I have is by Kelly Vallajos at the Quincy Institute, and it says the military signed contracts for Afghanistan well into 2023. That's their problem. So, of course, whenever you try to end a war, there's like a pile of different things that seem to happen, all trying to push the U.S. to not leave that war. One of the new things coming up is that, oh my God, we have a real problem. This was highlighted by CNN's Lieberman this morning, which says that Washington will be sued by private companies that have contracts with the U.S. government if they cannot continuing operating in Afghanistan through 2022 and 2023 because of the U.S. withdrawal. According to Lieberman, the U.S. signed 18 contracts totaling almost $1 billion after the agreement was signed in 2020. And so even though the Pentagon had this plan that was signed, by the U.S. and by the Taliban to leave Afghanistan by May 1st, they continued signing contracts with private companies to do business beyond May 1st. And now they're saying that, oh, we're going to get sued, so we can't leave. It's absurd. That it shouldn't even be a minor excuse. And if anything, it should just be another, strike against the Pentagon and more need for Pentagon reform, oversight, audits, and stuff like that. So I really liked Kelly's take on this, because a lot of people were just reporting it as, oh, the Pentagon's going to get sued. This is so terrible, when she really explains how the Pentagon kind of sunk itself into this trap. All right, some news on China, U.S.-China relations. The U.S. military launches a task force to fight information war against China. The Joint Task Force Indo-Pacific team will focus on information and influence campaigns in the Pacific theater. This is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. We got this information from the head of Special Operations Command, SOCOM, at the Senate Armed Services Committee. According to the report, the task force, known as the Joint Task Force Indo-Pacific Team, will focus on information and influence operations in the Pacific Theater, according to General Richard D. Clark. We are able to tamp down some disinformation that China continuously sows. Clark said it is not exactly clear what the new task force will be doing, but the report suggested that offensive cyber operations could be a part of the influence campaign. And so this narrative that really was nowhere prior to 2016 and has since just exploded, that we had to battle disinformation everywhere, is turning into just a real propaganda campaign. And look, I'm guessing that some of this will be, directed at the countries in the Indo-Pacific region, the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, like countries like this, where they have somewhat interesting relationship between the U.S. and China. They have deep relationships with China, but also have some relationship and sometimes long-standing military relationships with the United States. They have conflicts with China, but they also trade a lot with China. And so maybe a lot of this will also be directed at propagandizing those populations, as well as apparently offensive cyber operations against China. Other things going on with China, again from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. U.S., EU, and NATO take steps to unite against China. This is, I think, sanctions and stuff that me and Will have already talked about in the past on the show. But just to point out how much the entirety of, the Atlantic and the European continent is now working on uniting against China, seeing that as their future role. The NATO Secretary General John Stoltenberg has been big on this, and look, they're looking to build partnerships with Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, all to counter China. This is the North Atlantic alliance, and yet this is Oceania that we're now trying to build alliances with against China. And so this is further, I think, pushing the U.S. and China towards a hostile relationship. Here we have Biden saying that he's not going to let China become the world's leading country. And while this is a nice thing to say, and of course the U.S. and Russia have much larger nuclear arsenals than China, and so that I think is a legitimate barrier to them becoming a leading country. But if we don't want China to become a leading country, we need to stop wasting all of our time and effort killing people, and mostly innocent people, in the Middle East, and start to just invest to make America a great place where people want to buy all of our products, and they look as America at a leading country because you get all the good stuff in the world from America, not because we have influence here, there, and everywhere else, and we could bomb and kill anybody we want on anywhere on the planet Earth. The U.S. released a human rights report this week, and the report really blasts China over the Uyghurs and Russia over Navalny. The United States highlighted a deterring picture of human rights across the world. The Reuters staff writers write in this article calling out China's repression of Uyghurs and Russia's targeting of political dissidents, among other abuses. They did highlight things in here as well about, I believe, like Ethiopia and a few other countries. Now, the part about this and the reason I want to talk about it is because we use these kind of reports to justify sanctioning and demonizing all these countries: Russia, China, Ethiopia, Myanmar, whoever we have a particular problem with at that time. And yet we never look inward in the United States when, look, I'm not saying that there aren't human rights abuses in China, but it wasn't that many years ago where in the prison run by Sheriff David Clark in Milwaukee, they turned off the water to some guy's cell and left him in there for 7 days until he dehydrated to death. If you look at the pictures of these these camps along the southern border, whether under Trump or Biden, it's absolutely horrific what's going on there. All these kids detained and locked up. I just saw a video yesterday of 2 police officers screaming in the face and handcuffing some little 5-year-old boy from walking out of school. If we want to talk about human rights abuses, let's make a list of all the U.S. human rights abuses before we start to demonize other countries. Because you start to do things, and again, we've talked about this on this show in the past, you really push other countries together, and they're almost making like a alliance of countries of like the unwanted, at least from the eyes and perspective of the Americans, as we have Russia and China agreeing to work together against U.S. sanctions. And this week, in very big news, Iran and China signed a massive agreement to set 25 years worth of like kind of strategic investment by China in Iran, and for China to continue to buy Iranian oil for that time. I think one of the things that this was really telling about to me is that China doesn't have any plan to go back on sanctioning Iran. So the U.S. maximum pressure campaign, if the Chinese are willing to invest massive amounts of money in Iran and willing to buy Iranian oil. And look, if they're going to invest a lot of money, I don't think they're going to be putting on major sanctions against Iran. The U.S. maximum pressure campaign isn't going to work. And the worst part about it is it essentially just leaves Americans in the West out of the Iranian market. They do have a lot of oil. They have a lot of other interesting like kind of technology and industry in the country. It's a massive economy of 80 million people. They want to buy stuff. There's a lot of people in that country that I think are relatively like Western oriented and would be interested in a lot of the products and services the West has to offer, and yet the U.S. is making it impossible for American companies to do business with Iran, for European countries to do business with Iran. And then in a couple of years, I'm sure they're going to be writing massive reports about how China is increasing its influence in the Middle East. And this is something that has to be combated because, they have all this influence over Iran. The only reason they had the influence is because of the U.S. sanctions. Iran was more than willing to open up their economy to the West in 2015 and abided by a nuclear agreement that just put more restrictions on their civilian nuclear program than anybody else, any other country has to deal with. And yet they were willing to do that anyways to open up their economy to the West. Trump, even though they are following the agreement, destroyed it. And so now other countries can come in and have those close relationships with the the Iranian market. And it looks like China is a major role player in that. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said this week that this is from Reuters. Blinken says aspects of the U.S.-China ties are increasingly adversarial. And it's not like he said that and was like, boy, we really got to think over here in the U.S. of how we're going to do diplomacy and how we're going to work this out. Rather, he makes it sound like it's over the difficulties of the human rights violations in China and all that. Again, if he wants to talk about human rights violations, he could go down to the border and try to solve the problem there, rather than just constantly spitting in the face of the Chinese. It's the U.S. rhetoric that I think is in large way making the relationship with China adversarial. This is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. U.S. spy plane sets record for closest flight to China's coast. The plane came within 25.33 nautical miles of China's coastline. This was a Air Force RC-135U combat set, and it came again within about 25 miles. There were also some other spy planes, including a P-8A and EB-3F that were in that area as well. And this isn't some one-off spy plane flight. These planes are constantly flying close to the Chinese border. The last article I have on China here is a great one by Eli Clifton, again from Responsible Statecraft. And it's about how Lockheed Martin is exploiting the inflated threat of China to help enrich themselves. And the article is titled, Lockheed cites great power competition with China and bid to consolidate engine market. Clifton goes through here and explains that policymakers on both sides of the aisle are increasingly framing the China-U.S. relationship as a Cold War style competition. And I think in some sense that's right, that this has turned into a Cold War, but not because of necessarily the only the actions of the Chinese, but rather the actions of the Chinese and mostly the U.S. pivot to Asia and military buildup. And so Lockheed Martin is trying to buy the last independent engine maker, rocket engine maker in the U.S. called Aerojet Rocketdyne, and it's going to be a $4.4 billion sale. The other previous last independent arm, I guess there were two before 2017 when Orbital ATK was bought by Northrop Grumman. And so this is something that's been detailed by quite a few people, how the military-industrial complex continues to, eat up just more and more companies. And so, you have Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, and others But before, you had a lot more people that made a lot greater diversity of weapons. All these companies are kind of being bought up and rolled into just a few. And what the CEOs of these companies are saying is because of the threats from Russia and China being so severe. They also throw Iran and North Korea in that it's actually good that the American companies are being so consolidated and organized, and at least that's their claim. Now, the problems with this are that the threat from China isn't that big. The threat from Russia isn't that big. These are generally things that the military industrial complex have helped to amplify the threats of and make a bigger deal of, because it typically generates them more spending. Now, look, I'm not like somebody that supports antitrust legislation, but I do think we're talking about a little bit different situation here when you're talking about a company that is essentially just a private branch of the Defense Department, where all of the profits are privatized, but all the losses would be socialized. All the buyer is a social, it's the Pentagon. It's just the biggest honey pot in the world. So a lot of that going on here, the threat inflation coming from the military industrial complex, and we can see that they're getting rich on it. I got a few stories on Myanmar I want to get into, or Burma. I've got to say, I've been very tentative about talking about it on the show, because it seems like there's a lot of propaganda thrown in with the stories going on, but I'm not sure of that. And so if there's not, I don't want to say that. But it does seem that a lot of people are starting to die in Myanmar. The local reports are saying 500 people have been killed in since February 1st. Most of those people in recent weeks. There was a day where there was over 100 people that were killed. Again, this is by the coup government. February 1st, the military came in and overthrew the government there. Now, the military already had a lot of influence and power over the government. I guess they had lost an election in November, pretty bad, and so they had lost some influence, and this was their way of getting more. And yeah, so the military government there is nasty. I know there's a lot of ethnic independent militias that operate. They fight amongst themselves, amongst the military there sometimes. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the details that I have been able to pull. I feel pretty comfortable with. The first story, though, is from Reuters. U.S. reviewing Myanmar genocide determination, State Department official. And so this is actually looking back to 2017, when a group that's really not involved in the whole coup, the Rohingya, who are a Muslim minority group, were the subject of, at the very least, an ethnic cleansing campaign. About 1 million of them were pushed out of Myanmar and into refugee camps in Bangladesh, where life has not been so good. A recent fire killed as many as I think they have like a couple dozen casualties confirmed, and they're still missing a couple hundred people. Elephants have trampled people to death in these refugee camps. It's absolutely a terrible place. There's a bunch of them that get stranded on boats, are in remote islands out in the sea there. Bangladesh, it has a lot of poverty of its own and doesn't seem very interested in taking care of these refugees. India has, I guess, expelled some Rohingya Muslims during the past few years, and so there's not a good situation for this minority ethnic group really anywhere. Now, there was evidence of about 6,000, I think, killed in the 2017 ethnic cleansing campaign. I think it took about 3 weeks in August of 2017 that this was going on. There's video of the Myanmar army forcing the Rohingya to like burn down their own homes and stuff like that on video, and then they would put out the video, say, "Look, no, these people are burning their homes and leaving." That wasn't what was happening. They were driven from their homes. Now, in Myanmar, the military was separate, and I don't think under the control of the main government there, run by a Nobel Prize laureate, Aung San Suu Kyi. And so, but at the same time, she didn't condemn the genocide or the ethnic cleansing campaign, whatever you want to call it, and helped to kind of cover it up and helped to cover up the military there. In response, the U.S. did levy some sanctions against some of the military leaders. Now, come again February 1st, 2021, the government would be overthrown by the Myanmar military, but that's unrelated, I think, is the best I could tell, to this whole Rajinga thing. See any other details? I can't think of anything else important to add before we get into the other stories. Now, the Myanmar army seems to have started in recent days carrying out airstrikes and campaigns against some of the militant groups in the country that previously maybe had ceasefire agreements with the central military. And I don't know if it took, initially at least, took particular positions on the coup government. But now you have this particular militant ethnic group, the Karen National Union. Karen is a regional group in Myanmar, and they were the subject of airstrikes by the military there. And then they called for an international investigation and are pressing for more intervention from neighboring countries to get involved. And so in the past, the U.S. has looked to exploit these kind of things where you have some minority groups say, we need you to come in and save us. And that's how the U.S. has gotten involved in conflicts. And so that's one of the reasons I want to highlight this. There's also a group, the Arkanan Army, that exists, I believe, in the opposite side of the country as the Karen National Union. And they, at first, were supportive of the coup government and were actually removed from some kind of official terrorism list by the coup government because they were helping to, I guess, continue to enforce the peace. But they now say that they're condemning last month's military coup. And so there's this story at Reuters, and it says, as ethnic armies unite against coup, war returns to Myanmar's borderlands. I would say I think it's maybe misleading to say that the ethnic armies are uniting against the coup in any kind of way beyond all saying that they disagree with it. It's not saying that they're all going to join together in a single force and overthrow the coup government in Myanmar. That doesn't seem to be on the table here, and it just seems to be that there's several groups, the Karen National Union, the Restoration Council, Shan State, the Crane Army, a group with the initial CRPH that I'm not even going to try to pronounce, the Kachin Independent Army, the Karachi National Progressive Party. And these are all different groups in Myanmar that seem to have some kind of armed wing that are involved. Now, I do know there's at least some jihadist elements in Myanmar. This came to light during the 2017 ethnic cleansing campaign. I'm not sure if any of those elements have actual ties like to the leadership of Al-Qaeda Central, and what that, if it's more of an Al-Shabaab type situation, or if this is like Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and what ties those groups have to different militias. But I think that should be enough of a red flag for the U.S. To try not to get more involved, other than saying that, we want peace, offer to host talks. Sometimes that can be helpful to allow all these parties to get into the room together to say, this is what we want, this is what we want, this is what we want, and maybe help them to come to some kind of resolution on something. But intervention isn't the solution here. Interesting tweet here that I thought was important. Hopefully it loads up, but it's been a year now since any U.S. service members were killed in Iraq. And certainly it would be great if it stayed that way, and I could guarantee you it would stay that way if I were president, because I would have those troops out of Iraq by the end of the week. So that, I think that would be the solution there. But that is some good news, and again, got a few good news stories on this show. Before I wrap, Northern Mali officials say French strike killed civilians. France denies it, and this is again saying that a potential airstrike by France as a part of Operation Barkhane has killed civilians. And in the past, probably a month ago, they alleged that 20 civilians were killed at a wedding, and France denied that, but the UN now finds that to be true. French airstrike killed 19 civilians at wedding party in Mali, UN says. Now, it does say that 3 of those people were armed men who were attending the wedding, but that doesn't mean that though those armed men were necessarily like there as jihadists or anything. They could have been there as protection because of all the instability in Mali. Maybe they were worried about a raid being carried out on a wedding or something like that. Obviously, they didn't expect that raid to come from the sky, but they now know that, yeah, France did bomb a wedding in Mali, and this is a part of an operation that the U.S. is supporting. It's time to end that operation. France is trying to embroil the U.S. more in Mali. They want Biden to commit to, getting more involved there. We absolutely have to resist that. It's a mess in that country, and in large part it's because of the U.S. war in Libya, and then this ongoing French forever war that's been almost a decade now that they've been fighting in Mali. All right, that's the show for today, everyone. Hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you share the content. You find it on the social media accounts at Facebook, MeWe, Twitter, video versions on Odyssey and YouTube. Again, prefer Odyssey if you got an account there. Let's see, libertarianinstitute.org. I am the assistant editor at antiwar.com, so check out the viewpoints there. And yeah, thanks for supporting the show, everyone. We'll be back with another one on Friday.